All right, thank you, Kai. Thanks for joining, everyone. I wanted to thank Dominique Bachelet and Kai at the Conservation Biology Institute for hosting this webinar. So today's webinar is the first in an ongoing series in which Holly Hartmann will discuss best practices for evaluating climate change decision support tools and resources. Holly is the Director of Climate Science Applications for Carpe Diem West. She is a leader in research related to the development of decision support tools for climate, water, and other resource management applications, especially linking research with the needs of decision makers and moving research into agency operations. Formerly, Holly was the director of the University of Arizona Arid Lands Information Center, and she was a co-investigator with CLIMAS, NOAA's Southwest RISA team. And Holly joined CIRC, Pacific Northwest NOAA RISA team, in 2015 to help us develop and improve our decision support tools and resources in order to better meet the needs of decision makers. So today I'll discuss communication effectiveness as it relates to decision support tools and resources. And future webinars she'll discuss topics such as design strategies and tactics, and as well as sustainability after the research funding ends. So go ahead, Holly.
Thanks, Megan. Can you hear me okay? Just doing a check. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thanks everybody for being here. I see that we've got about 50 folks. It's more than what we have in CIRC, so I'm guessing that there are other folks besides CIRC team members here. That's great. This presentation is a follow-on from a set of discussions that we've been having within CIRC about how to evaluate decision support tools and resources as part of the CIRC project. My comments are primarily focused towards the CIRC team, and my goal is to have some discussion within this webinar, not just make it a presentation. But I'm happy to have other folks involved in the discussion if you want to chime in. What I'm going to do is just go through and have a little bit of an introduction about what is decision support, talk a little bit about why I'm interested in this, what my history is in evaluating decision support since my background is as a hydrologist. I'm going to talk a little bit about the decision support tool assessment framework that we're using within CIRC and show what this particular webinar is about, which is about communication effectiveness. Then I'll go into the meat of the presentation where we talk about the goals of communication effectiveness assessment. How are we thinking about language? What's our approaches and topics for evaluation, and then I'll be using some examples from CIRC and some from beyond, but mostly CIRC, the CBI's Sagebrush Climate Console, and the Northwest Climate Toolbox.
Hey Holly, can we have you talk a little bit louder? Some people are having a little bit of a hard time hearing you.
Okay, I'm on a, let me know. Okay.
Great, thanks.
Talk louder.
Okay, thank you.
let me know if I talk too loud then, all right? I'll be in here talking really loud. All right. So let's take a look at what is decision support. What is decision support? I use the definition from the National Research Council's report on informing decisions in a changing climate. It expands the notion of decision support so that it's not just producing and disseminating data and information, but it's also facilitating the use of data and information to improve the quality and efficacy of climate-related decisions. So the key is that we're not just giving out information, but we're having to connect with the wisdom, the perspectives of the decision makers that we're working with and bridge that gap and help develop knowledge on both parts, that is, us as the research community, and then with the decision makers we're working with. So just providing information is not enough. And we need to facilitate the use of data and information. Now, how did I come to this as a topic? Well, some of you know that I've been involved with decision support tools with CLIMAS, and then before that when I worked at the Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab, even in the 1980s, helping people deal with climate variability and how to make use of climate resources and forecasts and that sort of thing. This is a kind of a summary of what, in my experience, is common across all groups. It doesn't matter what sort of stakeholder that I've been working with, that folks have trouble with distinguishing between climate and weather. They have trouble interpreting information and often have misinterpretation habits dealing with some products. People do understand the implications of being uncertain versus having a false sense of certainty. In dealing with forecasts, the lack of demonstrated forecast skill is an issue. Then we've got issues that are common across a lot of stakeholders, maybe not everybody, but a lot. And the keys are, the key elements are, is they have trouble distinguishing between good and bad products, and they have trouble connecting the past, present, and the future, because information is scattered rather than integrated into a complete package often. And then we have a challenge that stakeholders are unique as well. The variables that concern them, where they're located, what the spatial scale of their projects are, their decisions are, what time of year, what kind of lead time, from months to years to decades, what kind of characteristics do they need in the products that they're going to use. Their technical sophistication is all over the map, from being very advanced to being very much a novice in thinking about climate information. And then how that information is going to be used is variable across stakeholders. So there really is a challenge in trying to develop tools and products and other information resources for stakeholders. The really driving force for me within the RISA project was dealing with the seasonal climate outlooks. Some of you have seen these pictures before. They're from a couple of them are from very early in the turn of this century, from 2000, 2003. The other one down in the lower left-hand corner is just within the last couple of years. That there's a pervasive misinterpretation of basic products that people see often. So I spent a lot of time trying to evaluate how people are perceiving and interpreting these products, and it led to, as just in one case, working with the Climate Services Division, where you can see here the whole range of products that come out of the seasonal climate outlooks, in particular for the local 3-month outlooks. Rather than just providing one product, they're now producing many kinds of products, recognizing that people have different needs, different ways of interpreting information, and that there are challenges in trying to present probability information that includes a whole distribution of possible temperatures or precipitation, for example. And I just want to highlight a couple of examples here. If you're all familiar with the seasonal climate outlook, up in the upper left corner, you can see that presenting the outlooks as pie charts with the probabilities associated with each of the 3 categories of temperature or precipitation conditions is one way of making sure that people don't just think it's a 2-category forecast that often the map gets interpreted as. We have more advanced products like the probability of exceedance curve or probability of non-exceedance curve, because depending on people's background and training, they are used to using one kind of curve and actually have trouble translating into the other kind of curve, whether it's a probability of exceedance or non-exceedance. And then over on the right, they produce even just simple text discussions about what that seasonal climate outlook is saying for that location, so that even a journalist or anybody can just pull out that text discussion and the values are in there. They don't even have to interpret anything. They can just drop it into an article or a newsletter. So this is just one example that really highlights that products have a lot more to them than just a simple chart or map. If you think about the seasonal climate outlooks, if you're really thinking about decision support, what does it mean to provide that support and facilitate the use of that product? It's providing not just the map, but making sure that people know the probabilities for all the categories, what the quantities are associated with those categories, what's the discussion behind that product about what tools are being used, how they seem to be working, what are the uncertainties in that product, an assessment of the skill of the tools that are being used, and if it's a forecast, the skill assessment of recent forecasts, and then helping people connect the dots, that is, providing an assessment of what our recent conditions are to put some context on it, and then provide some historical context about whether it's the climatological reference period, a longer historical period, or a focus on extreme conditions, and then providing a pathway to connect with other Outlook products, whether it's for a shorter time scale or more focused spatial scales, so that as a seasonal climate outlook progresses through time, they can keep track of how it's performing through some of the shorter term outlooks. You can see that that's a lot of information. It's a lot of material for anybody to provide or for a software tool to provide. There's some things you can do, for example, like developing templates, whether it's for individual contact or through a software tool, scripts for conversations or decision flowcharts for helping people work through what products to use and when and how. And then each of those templates or scripts or flowcharts are designed using the language of the people that you're working with, the frames that matter to them. So that's just for one product. You can sort of see the challenge that there's a lot of things to look at when it comes to decision support resources. So in thinking about CIRC 2.0, I just want to review the questions that are driving this CIRC 2.0. And in particular, the boxes that are in red are the questions that relate to our decision support tools. That is, how can decision support tools facilitate the use of data and information to help develop that knowledge and help build adaptive capacity across scales, over time, and so on. And then how do we evaluate those tools? Last summer, or in the fall, last fall, I had a webinar. We had a CIRC presentation on an overall framework for assessing the decision support tools under CIRC 2.0. They had 4 parts to it: design principles, strategies, and tactics, and then a framework for looking at tools from a user perspective, that is a decision maker perspective. We had a framework for looking at the technical sustainability of tools, which is really the perspective of the whole climate science enterprise. And then another framework that looks at the evaluation of tools from an academic research perspective. Megan can provide you with that white paper if you'd like. It just lays out, in a general sense, these 4 frameworks for looking at the tools. What we're focusing on here today is the decision maker and user perspective. And within that framework, there's different topics. That is, the usability from about whether the decision maker can actually use and understand the tool or the information product, the suitability in deciding whether the tool is right for them, and then the utility. It's how is the tool useful to them. Each of those has a different way of evaluating a tool. And even within usability, which is what we're talking about here today, can people understand the tool, the information product? There's a couple of different components. One is, if you're dealing with a software tool, is a focus on a software user interface. And I'm not talking about that today. That's a different subject about how you actually assess whether a software interface is usable and how it can be made more intuitive for people using software. What we're going to focus on today is the language and formats used to create products and how we might go about testing them and some of the concepts that we're going to be looking for in testing them or evaluating them. So I do want to show, though, that there's a connection to this design principles and strategies that we'll be talking about in the next webinar. And that is, there's a couple of principles that each group within CIRC has to kind of decide whether they really are committed to that principle or not. We've had some beginning discussions, but we haven't really finalized any of that across the team. But one is that one principle that's important that we sort of come to terms with for a tool is, do we prioritize knowledge development over information delivery? Like that first slide that had the dog and the skunk. That are we really committed to knowledge development, not just putting information out? And then the second principle that we sort of have to commit to is that, or decide that we don't, is that notion of, are we providing equity of access to information? Meaning we need to have communication for a range of users of different levels of technical sophistication and resource capacity. There are alternatives. For example, if a tool or decision support is primarily directed at policy and regulatory impact, it may be more of a consultation relationship, and some of these principles wouldn't necessarily apply if we're looking at the assessment of the usability by the decision maker. Then it's more a personal kind of a focus. But if we are looking at the equity of access across a range of people, then, or of stakeholders, then what we're talking about here applies. So I should say, are there any questions or comments at that point? Megan, do you have any?
This is Kai. I don't see any questions from the audience, but Megan might have a question, maybe?
Nope, no questions here.
Okay, well, if anybody does, this is the time. Let's leave a little bit to see if anybody has any questions or comments about the sort of where we are in this framework of evaluating decision support from a decision maker's perspective.
So you should be able to type any of those questions in that text box in the upper right-hand corner of your GoToWebinar prompt. I don't see any at the moment, but...
Okay. Give people a minute or so just to... All right. All right, so let's go on and talk about, in particular, communication effectiveness. And what our goals are, the whole point that we're looking at this, is that we would like our tools and products to be approachable by a range of decision makers and stakeholders, and we want them to be relevant and seen as relevant to what those decision makers and stakeholders are concerned about. We want, in particular, that their interpretation of those products is correct and that it's reliably correct, no matter what message that product is sending, that the users can interpret it correctly. So whether it's for example, in the seasonal climate outlooks, if it's for a high probability of precipitation being in the upper range of values, people can interpret that just as correctly as when the outlook says something very different, like an increased likelihood of precipitation being in the lower part of the distribution. And we want the interpretation to be easy. We don't want people to have to struggle, or we certainly don't want people to look at a product and say, this just looks so complicated, it must not be meant for me, even though we as designers of information products are aiming towards that decision maker. We want that decision maker to recognize that that tool is for them and not for a specialist, for example. So in looking at tools and products, it's not just a software interface or a graph. Any kind of product, we're looking at both the format of the product and then the language that's being used to communicate it. And not just the language that's, say, on a graph or a map, but the language that talks about where that product came from, how it was developed, all the ancillary information that really is needed to fully communicate that product. That product can be delivered in a number of ways, either dynamically, like through a software tool, or it can be a static product in a report. The product can have a lot of links to dig deeper and deeper and deeper into how that product is created and what it means, or it may have to be all integrated. In particular, in a static report, all the information may have to be in one piece, and we wouldn't want the information to be scattered all over. This is where, if this is as far as you get in this presentation, I just want to put some recommendations right up here before we get into some of the details. And that is, in the creation of any decision support tool or resource, we do want to structure information within a product format, even a simple map or a graph, to help people know where to start looking at the map or graph, to help structure that information and help them know what to look at first, and then second, and third, and fourth. We find that people look at a map or even a graph, and it takes so long for them to figure out what they're supposed to look at that it creates problems in even thinking that product is for them. We want to help reinforce basic concepts and principles, and it's amazing how basic some of these concepts and principles are that we need to reinforce. That is about just the difference between, that is using a median versus a mean for precipitation, for example. Just what is climate versus weather, some of the misinformation about climate variability or change, the difference between weather variability and trends, for example. There's some basic concepts and principles to try and reinforce in every product. And then in developing a product, we would like to use language and formats that are consistent with best practices and evolving standards. And what I mean by that is that there are some documents that different groups have put out about effective language for dealing with climate topics. The IPCC, the National Climate Assessment, and other reports put out by the REISs and other groups provide sort of the model for the kind of language to use. And the question is are your decision support tools and products consistent with kind of those gold standards for communication? And then there's also evolving standards, not just from the climate community, but with the communities that you're engaging with or designing the tools for. Whether it's for water management, and you've got the Water Resources Bulletin 17C now, which supplants the old 17B, where they have specific language about statistics or frequency distributions. Does your product connect with that language? And so this is sort of a place for some discussion within the CERC group and others. Here's my question to you. Are any of you consciously, explicitly using either communication best practices documents now in the design of your tools or products? Are you following specifically the language of the IPCC reports or National Climate Assessment reports? Are there standards documents within your field or within CERC that the group's using?
So I have a question here from Liz Law. Excuse me. First, she wants to say thanks for putting this one on. She's wondering if there is a resource that might list some of the best practices standards documents in different fields.
I'm not aware of in different fields that kind of is a comprehensive list across all fields. That would be great to have. That may be something that that would come out of this CERC project or across REISs if different groups are using different documents. Certainly for some of the folks that work with tribal groups, there's definitely best practices in terms of communication process and content. And then the National Climate Assessment reports, some of the other regional reports that are kind of considered good standards. Here are some that you may want to look at, but I really would like to know within CERC or within anybody here on the webinar, are there documents that you're using? Certainly the climate literacy document put out under the U.S. Global Change Research Program that you see here on the lower left, that's a good one for looking at climate concepts, and you can compare your products with any of those concepts to see whether they're connecting and explaining them in a way that's consistent with this climate literacy report. And then here for CERC, there's the National Climate Assessment Report, and there's specific language that's used in that that is kind of the standard for talking about climate change in the Northwest and across the different RISA groups, or across the regions in the country, the National Climate Assessment regions. And so the question is are your tools consistent with that language, or will people have to make the leap and do translation on their own to go from your tool to this other kind of standard report? And then I should say that there's this, what we see here in this table is something that came out of a report from Somerville and Hassel in where there's specific guidance on language for communicating with whether it's the public or whether it's different stakeholder groups, and it shows the difference in kind of the common English interpretation of words versus what we in the science community, how we might interpret those words.
So it looks like one of your CERC members, Paul Gessler, is suggesting organizing a list of these resources on the CERC website that would be available for the team. Mm-hmm. He wanted to sort of reinforce what Liz had asked.
Okay. Let's start doing that. And then if anybody is using any report, let me know as well. That would be great. And then Megan, I mean, within the CERC 2.0 office with John and others, is there sort of a communication, like a style sheet?
Not that I know of, Holly.
Okay. Okay. So that is a good place to start, I think.
So John Matthews has, let's see what it says here. There's been a lot of work around DSS for water management and climate adaptation, especially around infrastructure management, but to a lesser degree around ecosystems as well. The most sophisticated approach, his example is the project led by the World Bank or UMass Amherst, was in development for 5 years. He's been working on an analogous project with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Dutch government and UNESCO for about 6 years, and they're looking to publish next month.
Well, that would be great.
And then I see another comment from Jenna Jorns. If CERC could share this list of resources with the RISAs, I'm not sure what that stands for, RISAs. That would be great. Then there's another comment from Catherine Moore Powell. I've participated in an AGU communicating science workshop and like their online resources, so it might be something to check out.
Yeah, certainly within the climate.data.gov and the climate toolbox through the federal initiative, that there are a set of resources there, and it within the CERC project at least, at some point we will need to make a commitment to certain documents and to say that is kind of our style sheet or our design standards for development.
You know, Holly, this is Megan. I think many but maybe not all members of our CERC team and certainly other RISAs are familiar with some of the Somerville and Hassel better choice words over others, but I think you're right that sort of having a list of what are our standards and what we'll go by and have that be consistent across our products is a great idea.
Yeah, because I think we'll see some examples, and it's not to harass on the Sagebrush Climate Console or the Northwest Climate Toolbox, but it's just an inevitability as these tools get designed, right? It's just something everybody has to go through. So we'll see that. So moving on and thinking about how we might do, go ahead.
Oh, there was just one more comment from Julian Reyes. It would be interesting to see what other federal climate change coordination networks do. For example, the USDA climate hubs or climate science centers or LCCs, specific to the style sheet or design standards concept, just to make sure we capture that.
great. All right. And then, so in thinking about how we do the evaluation, the goals are in doing the evaluation, we have to think about, are we, which are our goals? Are we really focused on informing the development of the decision support tools? Do we also, or do we also want to publish research? Do we want to publish our results? If it's the latter, it's a different level of effort than doing some quick assessments about communication that may not be up to the standards that you might need for publishing the results. So it does help to know what your goal is in doing the evaluation. There's a lot of different methods. I'm not an expert on methods. I'm sure there are people here in this group that are much more expert. The approach I've always taken is just a pragmatic, empirical approach in trying to develop the tools. So there's a number of different ways. There's remote approaches, whether through its online surveys or phone interviews. A good example is the climate change training needs assessment and developing some of the climate change training guidance for the Intermountain region of the Park Service. It used those methods. There's field testing where you go out into a group of decision makers and either have questionnaires or one-on-one interviews, not to ask whether they like the tool or what they would do with the tool, but you're actually testing whether they can interpret those products correctly. I've got examples of those. I don't want to show them today, but I'm happy to send out some examples of questionnaires that were used to look at the seasonal climate outlooks and help inform some of the development of these dynamic seasonal climate outlook products like you saw with the local 3-month temperature outlook. We can also ask in focus groups, but the challenge there is that we're not trying to have discussions about the tools because we don't want people learning as we go along with the tools. We really are wanting to test how they see that tool or product the first time. We can ask, we have to really think about when in a meeting or a workshop or a training we might ask those questions to capture what it is that they're pulling out of the product, not out of the training or the overall discussion. So in thinking about how you design an evaluation approach, certainly it's thinking about your population. Who are you targeting? What is that common population that connects with the stakeholder group? It should be similar to that stakeholder group that you're designing your tool or product for. We want independent testing of the different formats and language. That is, we don't want them to be learning as they go along. You don't show them 3 or 4 or 5 different versions of the product, because by the time they get to the 5th one or the 3rd one, they've already learned something from the other 2. We'd like to see just, so you have to figure out how you're going to run your sampling to get a sufficient sample size, but you need independent testing of the different product formats. So you're looking at, in the protocol, looking at multiple versions of a product, maybe the current version or several design possibilities. Each person would just gets to see only one version because you're wanting their interpretation of that product. So you also need to design that, make sure that you look at, have a good representation of the surveys you're putting out, the questionnaires you're putting out with the mix of products. And then it's also nice to supplement that with one-on-one interviews where you actually give someone the same instrument, the survey instrument that's asking them to look at this product, but you have someone sit with them and actually walk through or talk through what they're thinking as they're answering the questions. It really provides a lot of insight about where they're struggling with what a tool or product is trying to communicate. So what kind of things are you going to be evaluating? Well, there's 3 general categories of what you might be evaluating. That is, whether the products connect the people and the products. That is there some misalignment between the people and the product? And then the second one is trying to identify and discern information from a product. And then the third is, can the user actually translate and extend the information from the product into language that fits what their, the way that they work. So in thinking about the people and the product, what are our priorities? We may never come up with a perfect product, a single perfect product. Our goal is to at least eliminate the poor products, because there are plenty of products where it just reinforces misinterpretation, and those are the ones we're really trying to just to get those at least out of the mix, or adjust them so that they aren't reinforcing misinterpretation and miscommunication. We may need to come up with a diversity of products, or products that can be customizable. And those of you who are working to develop software tools that allow users to develop customized products, you know the challenge in that. But if even within a static product, like in a report, you may want to try to communicate that same information in different ways, because people have different cognitive frameworks for looking at information. And here are some of the challenges that we find in connecting people in the product. Is that products are complex, but without a structure for them to walk through the product. And that's what I had said in the recommendation, is that we need to get some structure in helping people, even though in a simple graph, to what us to seem simple, is to what should they look at first, second, third, so on, step them through the product. There's persistent problems with language, and in particular, anybody that knows me knows that I'll get up on this soapbox about using the difference between a median and a mean, or an average, and the challenges that puts on people for trying to understand precipitation and flows and other variables that are not normally distributed. It just misrepresents what the information is. And we do want to try to figure out whether people have bad habits of misinterpreting information. And in some products, we find that people that are experienced with a product actually do worse in interpreting the information than brand new users who've never seen it before. So those are the kind of things that we're looking for in trying to connect the people and the decision support product we're looking at. Then we're actually trying to test whether they can identify and discern things from that product. Can they tell what the variable is? It's not always clear, and they don't always get that right. What is the variable? Is it temperature, or is it a temperature range, or is it a temperature probability? What is it? What's the reference period that anything is referring to? What's the appropriate spatial scale that the product should be is trying to represent, and does that align with the spatial scale of their decisions, right? So they need to know, they need to be able to get that correct. What are the numerical scales? And in particular, in terms of probability, people are not always clear that probabilities sum to 100%. And then in looking at the kind of, every piece of information has uncertainty associated with it. What's the character of that uncertainty within a particular product? Is it that it's a probability? Is it a likelihood? Is it a confidence? Are we talking about scenarios? Just what's the character of the uncertainty? So just a simple test within a questionnaire, can people pull out and answer correctly about that product, about what's the variable, the reference period, the scales, what kind of uncertainty? It's surprising what you may find about what people really are reading when they're looking at your product. And then the question is can they actually translate the meaning of that product, or will they, or can they just mimic the language of the product? And we find some things like the seasonal climate outlooks where people will go to great lengths just to mimic the language because they don't have confidence or they don't have the background to actually translate that meaning into their own terms. And in particular, the difference between looking at a 3-category forecast, whether it's you're looking at near normal conditions or above normal and below normal, whether you're looking at a mean or a median, or what the climatology, what does climatology mean? Just asking people to describe what that means can lead to a lot of insight in developing your tool. And then there's some other things like looking at just reinforcing concepts about total probability sums to 100%. When you have a probability information and you're increasing the probability of one thing, then there's something else that has to have a reduced probability. And the key information may be in the reduction of a likelihood of something rather than an increase of a chance of something. So other kinds of concepts, the trade-off between precision and certainty, and that you can't have both at the same time. And so trying to test whether people can, on their own, from your product, make that trade-off between precision of information and the level of certainty associated with it. And then when it comes to things like scenarios or projections, can they really express the meaning of those? Can they talk about averaging across models or across scenarios and kind of distinguish that you average across models but not across emission scenarios, for example? And can they translate the meaning of a variability versus a trend? And then can they connect any of those concepts with their decision processes? What are they doing when they're trying to connect it to their variables that they have, whether it's through a water management decision or a forest managed decision? How, do they understand how to monitor the change in that information over time to come back to this tool or to connect to another tool that helps them update the information? And then can they actually align the level of information certainty or uncertainty in your product with the kinds of decisions that are appropriate for that level of certainty or uncertainty? For example, if you have a seasonal climate outlook and there really is no indicated shift in the likelihood of any conditions, then that's a different decision strategy than if there's a very strong statement, for example, that the chance of having high precipitation has really increased. So can they align their possible decision strategies with the quality of information in the product? Here's some examples. That's all very general. It helps to look at some examples. So I just want to look at the Conservation Biology International Sagebrush tool, the Climate Console. This is something that Dominique Bachelet has been involved with making happen, and her team. We did we've had some discussions about this tool and had some back and forth about some of the design and testing more on the usability interface testing, but there's still there are definitely some kind of language and communication effectiveness issues as well. It's not to pick on Dominique if you're there. They're great tools, but every tool kind of has to go through an evolution. This is just one of the kinds of products that's produced by that. The black arrows and the text in the boxes is something that Dominique's group had put out to help a stakeholder group connect with the tool and understand it. And it kind of shows what they're doing. They're allowing you to look at different scenarios from different models and emission scenarios, and look at different variables over different time periods, and then comparing it to historical conditions. And so the kind of things that you might test from this are, can people pull out what is the historical reference period? How many different models? What are these models? Can they tell what the variable is, what the units are? Can they actually tell that it's degrees centigrade and not a chance of something happening, for example? Here's that same product in what it comes off of the website. What you see on the left is the product, and you can click on some information and you actually get a text interpretation over here on the right that helps you interpret it. That's really great. You can see in English language. So that's great that there's a text interpretation so that people don't have to struggle over what's in the graph. They can read it off of out of the text. But there are some language issues maybe. For example, the use of model averages versus historical averages, and certainly if we're looking at temperature, it may not be a problem, but if we're looking at precipitation, the use of an average is not recommended. It's more of we should be using a median because precipitation is skewed. There's a lot more. The high values don't happen as often, but they bring up the mean. We have a lot of low values that happen more frequently, but they're overwhelmed by these extreme high events for precipitation and flows. It's not a normal distribution, and so the use of an average is not so appropriate. And then in this product, it's not clear what the emission scenario is. It's disconnected. It is there if you click on the question mark, or to get information about the climate data, for example. You can find it, but it's not embedded right there on the tool. Someone would have to go somewhere else to find it. And then, again, here's not to pick on anybody. This is just, I looked at the Northwest Climate Toolbox because we've been trying to have our discussions and kind of look at the design of this. Every tool goes through an evolution. It's not to pick on anybody, but there are some things that just kind of jump out. If you want to look at this, it's they're showing future projections under different time periods for a specific climate model. It's not clear from this product on the face of it about what emission scenario it is. The spatial scale in the text description is different than the spatial scale. It's just a different units than what's presented in the product. It's not clear what the model is. It may be in the code as an acronym there on the right under that leftmost arrow, but it's not clear what that is in the product itself. There's supporting information about it, but it's not so clear. And then if you go look at each of these tools, also looks at the seasonal climate outlooks as well. It's interesting in looking at the Sagebrush tool, for example, that it's not accessed under climate, it's accessed under a tab called weather, even though it deals with the 3-month seasonal climate outlook. So we already know that people have trouble discerning between weather and climate variability and climate trends. This is one of those things that helps reinforce that miscommunication or misunderstanding, is calling this weather. And then again, we have the issues of, you can see on the arrow here on the down below the red arrow, is that the focus on the historic means creates some challenges. They have a really interesting product here where you can look at all of the outlooks, the seasonal climate outlooks at once. This would be a really interesting product to try to test. I do notice that it talks about a forecast mean. It shows a confidence interval about those seasonal climate outlooks. It's really great. But you can see right from those confidence intervals that it's a skewed distribution for precipitation in the blue down on the bottom. So just using the mean isn't really communicating. It gives people a misimpression on what the most likely values might be. The Northwest Climate Toolbox also talks about the seasonal forecasts, seasonal outlooks, but in their case, it's not clear. If you look at that middle arrow, it's not the official seasonal climate outlooks. It's a particular modeling approach, the NMME, the multi-model ensemble. So it's different than what folks might see from NOAA, from the Climate Prediction Center, for example. There's nothing on here that talks about what is the skill or the confidence of these forecasts. There's not a probability associated with these. They're a deterministic forecast, so it implied 100% probability that this is what the precipitation will be. And then there's still the issue of using model averages and time averages when for precipitation we might be better to use medians. So I don't want to leave folks just saying that it's a big problem. Every product goes through an evolution. And I just want to end with an example of a product that really has gone through, I think, some of the best evolution over this last decade in terms of the seasonal climate outlooks, and that is through the Australia Bureau of Meteorology. I encourage you to go to their site and just take a look at how they're communicating their seasonal climate outlooks. You can see there's a lot of arrows here on the left where they allow folks to get this product in a lot of different formats. They're using a two-category forecast. What's the chance of being above or below the median value? They provide you some scenarios where you can look at a particular portion of the distribution that is in the lowest quarter, the middle 50% of the distribution in the upper quarter. What's the chance of at least getting a certain amount of precipitation or a certain temperature? And what's the past accuracy of these outlooks? And then way up here on the top, you can see in the block on the red arrow that they actually provide a text view. And if you click on that, they turn this whole product into a static version with all of the ancillary text that you get when you dig deep on that dynamic interface of the website. So this is one that maybe I put out as a model or a standard for CERC 2.0 to consider in terms of the use of some language or structuring a product in thinking about how we might take any of the products and maybe adjust the language or adjust how we communicate them. So where do we go from here? I know we're getting towards the end of the time. There's the idea is that I will then connect with any of the stream teams working with different tools to talk more specifically about their tool, how we might structure an evaluation for communication effectiveness. The nice thing about it is that you don't have to do it all at once. You can focus on any product. It doesn't have to be integrated into your software tool. It can just be a mock-up, and you can take it to a meeting or a group of stakeholders and test its effectiveness and test the language. The other webinars that we're going to be talking about next are some of the design principles and the strategies and tactics for designing your tools and products. And then we'll, in April, we'll be talking about evaluating the technical sustainability. I want to emphasize that we aren't really done with the decision maker's perspective. There's the user interface testing that still is out there. And I know that for the folks developing software tools, that's often their prime interest, is just getting the user interface right and have it be very intuitive for users. And so we can go more into that. And then there's also the issues of helping decision makers identify whether the tool is the right one for them, and then whether it's actually useful and how it connects to their decision processes. So there's more in this whole webinar series. Kind of the next steps for CERC 2.0 is to develop this common language or our best practices and our style sheets, and then to think about doing an assessment of the CERC 2.0 tools compared to that style sheet or the standards. And here's sort of my question about, does the social science team get involved with that in helping develop some of those questionnaires or protocols for the surveys? How do we handle some of the information structure so that we can compare across the different teams and tools? Because we are using some of the same language, no matter what tool we're using. So with that, I just open it up for any kind of questions and comments.
Well, great. Thanks, Holly. One question that I don't know we can talk about later, there's some interest in maybe if you would be willing to share the slides, we can include that in the email. So that's just one thing to maybe consider. This will be recorded, so folks that want to see it again, you can always flip through that way. I see a question from Phil Mott. He wants to know some examples. He says, Holly, some of the examples you gave seem simple and clean, but you indicate that they didn't have enough information examples, definitions of model average, noting which RCP was used, etc. Do you have recommendations for keeping the information simple enough to understand but complete?
That's a challenge, right? And Phil, you've dealt with that just through the National Climate Assessment Report for the Northwest. And so using some of that language out of that report and others that, whether that have come out of the program office or if there's others that kind of within the region, folks are holding up and saying this is a good standard, or that we test and that it is effective, then migrating across that across all the tools would be a way to go. So my recommendation would be to use language that is at least consistent with some of these standard reports that are out there, and then that Australian seasonal climate outlook tool is really nice. Some of the language that they use, maybe not all of it, but that's why we do the testing and try different versions.
A quick just reminder about when the next two webinars are. You mentioned the months, but do you have dates for those? I might actually have them.
I think the 27th of March, so the next one is March 27th.
Sorry, it's Holly, this is Megan. The next one, yeah, sorry, you're right, March 20, yeah, you're right. I was looking at April. March 27th at 1:30, and then April 24th also at 1:30.
Yeah, so just a month apart. And then what I'll do is, yeah, these slides will be available, and then I can add some of the example questionnaires. We'll try to put together a kit. I would like to have some conversations with the different stream teams as we do the consults, and by the CERC retreat, maybe have a first cut of whether it would be the kind of recommended language or style sheets or a plan for doing some of the testing for going forward with the tools.
So we actually have another question from Tim Sheehan. He's asking about some comments regarding the usefulness of clickable explanation text within tools to keep the interface uncluttered. So you click on like an icon and it gives you text, but at the same time providing explanations for users that are unfamiliar with terms, or to explain methods used in a way that's understandable.
Yeah, and that's all great. That gets into the user interface testing, right, for a tool. But in terms of the information product, if key information is left out of a final product, people are cutting and pasting those things and putting them in presentations, putting them in newsletters, and key information just gets dissociated from an output. So trying to figure out, or at least just making a decision about what is that key information that really should be in a final product, a standalone product that doesn't have clickable capabilities. So that Australian example is a good one because they end up with a final text version that includes the ancillary information.
Great. So Eric Seaman has a little bit higher level question. He says, it seems that we have differing teams working on tools separately that seem to be magnifying the complexity. So I'm thinking maybe that's about models and tools as well.
Yeah, that is a challenge, and I think that's one of the reasons within CERC 2.0 that this is a cross-stream activity, right? So that having, focusing on this and then trying to think about what do we want to come up with some common language, and it's not for me to say what that should be. I think it really should be for the team to ultimately decide what they're willing to do.
Okay, and I have just a quick link to share with folks from Allison York. It's the Joint Fire Science Program, and she sent a URL along here to a PDF, so I'm going to go ahead and put it in the chat for folks. if you'd like to go ahead and take a look at that. Holly, you might even be able to, click on the chat and it'll show up. Yeah, there you go.
Right. So is there a part that she'd like to have us look at?
Let's see if she...
Page 26, I think, is something like that. I'm just trying to...
No, she said you were just asking for resources, so she wanted to pass it along.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, because it looks like there's some things here that would definitely apply. Yeah, some of these are much more. Some of these are general in scope, and then others are just right in line with what CERC 2.0 needs. All right. Any other questions or comments?
I don't see any come in. We can give folks a minute or two more. We're about at the well, we're a little over the hour.
And I've got my email on the first slide, so if anybody has any questions or comments, feel free to contact me anytime.
Can you show that first slide again, just because there were folks that had asked for that, and perfect.
Sure. Right there.
Holly, this is Megan. Thank you for presenting this. I think it may spur some further discussion with the CERC team, perhaps at our next meeting. So thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much, Holly. It's been great, and thanks, Megan, for joining us as well. And thank you all who have attended. And we will be sending out both the recording as well as sounds like Holly's willing to share her slides with us. So thank you for that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks.